Hello, everyone. We have a bunch of people already, but let's wait 2 more minutes before we start. So I think we are good to go. Welcome again. This is the first session of IETF 111, not quite morning for most of us. So let's get going. I'm Yaron Scheffer, and I'm glad to have Liv here, my co-chair. Liv? I guess video is still not on.
I'm not sure that he's on.
Yeah, I can see him on the queue. And I'd like to thank Kathleen, who volunteered to help us lead this session. So Kathleen will be managing the speaker queue, and yeah, so let's get going. And here's Liv. Hello, Liv. Great to see you here. Liv was unable to join us for the last few months, but now he's back in full force, I hope, and I'm very happy to see him here.
Thank you, Yaron.
And Liv, if you could keep an eye on the chat window so that we don't miss any important discussion taking place there. And thank you. All right, so the note well applies to virtual meetings just as much as to physical meetings. This meeting is governed by the IETF rules regarding intellectual property and privacy. If you haven't read it yet, please go find the note well and take a quick look. In general, please keep your video off unless you're either a chair or you're presenting a session. And please mute your microphones. There are no blue sheets. This is automatic now. Please use the chat. It's the same as Jabber. And that's it. And now, for the first checkpoint, we are looking for a minute taker. Taking minutes is a good opportunity to get to know both the actual topics and the people. So can you please unmute yourself and let us know if you're willing to take minutes? Unfortunately, we cannot move forward without minutes. So please, please, please. This was Christina. All right. Thank you very much, Christina, for taking notes. You can use any old Emacs, or you can use CodeMD. The link is on the slide, and it's already ready with some material filled in, so that would be even more convenient. If you're doing it offline, please send the minutes to Leif and myself after the meeting. All right, slides are already uploaded into Meet Echo, so we'll try to use this new and brilliant technology. Agenda for today. After this short introduction, we will go into a presentation by Adrian Gropper, followed by the main part of the session, where the editorial team will discuss the latest of the Gnap core protocol, as well as the resource server draft. Then we will have a next steps discussion, and in fact, I would like to allocate 20 minutes to that instead of the 10. So editors, please take note. You have until 8:40 UTC. And then everyone is welcome. There's a half-hour break after the session. So please join us on Gather Town in room 7. And with that, let's move on to the next deck. Let me see if I can do it. Adrian, you go next. Please.
Say the word.
Please go ahead.
Okay, next slide. I should introduce, I'm the Chief Technology Officer of a nonprofit called Patient Privacy Rights. It's a volunteer position. And I also lead an implementation of self-sovereign technology protocols built around some of the standards that I'll be talking about today and that we're working on Gnap. I was a core participant in the transition from UMA 1.0 to 2.0 around the sort of self-sovereign technology principle. I want to talk for only a few minutes and leave as much time for discussion as the chairs and people will tolerate. It's a bit of a controversial topic, but I think it's very well aligned with our mission and our goals in this work group and IETF in general. I want to talk about the human rights perspective on protocol design, where we're not just talking about privacy to the individual, but the impact on society, the efficiency that is increasingly shifting power not to self-sovereign people through decentralization, but actually to the sovereign corporations and governments. And to deal with that, protocols are essential. You know, standardized data models like verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers are great, they are useful, but they do not have a primary impact on the human rights perspective. I'm going to just describe one slide of what aspect of self-sovereign identity I think matters. The issue of separation of concerns, sort of we're familiar a bit with the GDPR, the legal difference between a controller and a processor, and the separation of concerns of not lumping them together in the standard sort of Facebook model, if you would. And then, well, how do you do controls? What's going on in W3C and diff? And as I said, I hope to have 10 or 15 minutes for discussion. Next slide, please. So what are the human rights concerns? It made me think of Tyrell Corporation in the movie Blade Runner, where, the problem was that it was really impossible for humans to regulate what a corporate entity did once it sort of became a thing of its own. The kind of concerns we have are like facial recognition, which I'm calling ambient authentication. It's been banned in a couple of jurisdictions, but it's still out there. Non-repudiable authentication, in other words, strong credentials where weak credentials would do. Barriers to anonymity because of the ubiquitous surveillance. I mentioned strong credentials. Chain of custody protocols that are a little bit like pre-crime. You don't know ahead of time that a crime has been committed, but you impose chain of custody possession protocols just in case a crime will be committed. A lack of agency, in other words, the lack of the right to have a lawyer or a doctor that you choose represent you in front of the sovereigns, in front of the institutions. Controls on free assembly, in other words, the ability to prevent or manage the formation of gangs, if you would, or congregations, or et cetera, as self-sovereign entities. And proprietary AI, again, that sort of turns a lot of what concerns humans into either trade secrets or just intellectual property instead of education. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide. I'll simply say that self-sovereign identity could be thought of as an identity that only you control. There's no third party, there's no domain controller or anybody else. And it basically has a public component, the decentralized identifier and the DID method. And in the DID document, in the things that are controlled by you, you have a service endpoint. And that is the demarcation point, if you would, between that which is public and that which is protected, what we would call the resource servers and the authorization servers in Gnap. Everything else is a processor. In other words, everything other than your identity, whether it's a nation or a vendor, or is basically a sovereign as far as you're concerned. Sometimes you have a choice, but very often you don't have a choice of sovereigns unless you want to be a refugee. And the control models, which I'll say a little bit more in a second, are either direct control through possession, messaging type control, where you get to pick an email address. And again, it's kind of a possession-based thing because you're going to include the document or whatever, the verifiable credential in the message, but you get to choose the address. And the mediator. And an example of a mediator in the wild right now is Apple Sign-In, where they'll give you an email proxy in both directions. And then the one we care about here, of course, is the delegated control model, where you have an authorization server. I've worked, as I mentioned, on UMA 2, and we all understand a little bit about why Gnap is where we are. Next slide, please. So where do I hope, or what's my picture? What do I want you to keep in mind as we go to the discussion slide section? We originally had the narrow waist being internet protocol, and then you see all those alternatives, email, WWW, phone, on one side, copper, fiber, physical layer. What we ended up with, partly as a direct result of OAuth, is a platform narrow neck where we get to choose our sign-in with Facebook or sign-in with Google, unless you happen to be a geek, and then you can sign in with GitHub. And it's a matter of what Doc Searles calls choose your captor at the narrow waist. As we move to self-sovereign identity, I would maintain that there is this thing that I'm calling the minimum viable protocol as the narrow waist. where on the one side you have the application level stuff, on the other side you have the services layers. EDV, by the way, stands for Encrypted Data Vaults. I'll just mention that briefly later on. And so what I hope to discuss and the role of Gnap is around this MVP. Next slide, please. So specifically, we can bring up, these are 5 W3C and DIF protocol work groups. The one that I'm most involved in, and Justin is as well, I don't know about the others because I don't attend all of them, is the Verifiable Credential API protocol work. There's also the Encrypted Data Vaults, Identity Hubs, which has been around for a long time. We can talk about them, but it's basically person-centered storage. DIDCOM, which is message level security, and going back to having a self-issued component to OpenID Connect called self-issued OP. Next slide, please. So that's it. I would like to basically pose these 5 questions for the group. Down below, you have my contact info, and I really, really welcome a continuation of the discussion, as well as help in implementing Gnap in the particular way that we're trying to do it in the HIE of 1 example implementation of various standards, including DIDs and VCs in the healthcare context. HIE stands for Health Information Exchange of 1. So it is sort of this idea that you can have a self-sovereign agent. So the questions are, as you can read them yourselves, how many authorization protocols does the internet need at that narrow waist? Do we need something other than Gnap in the narrow waist there? How do we feel about, compatibility with OAuth in terms of the human rights, and particularly things like client credentials that are often associated with OAuth? Do we understand and recognize the difference between self-sovereign agents and fiduciary agents? Both are important to human rights, and if people want to discuss that, I'm happy to go into it. How to detach the chain of custody type protocols that, like I say, treat every transaction as a pre-crime event potentially, without actually introducing biometrics that we have associated with analog credentials in the past. And finally, the big question is, should Gnap be seen as the narrow waist of self-sovereign identity? Thank you. I'm done with the presentation.
Thank you, Adrian. Questions, comments, discussion?
All right, Justin?
All right, I think I'm sending, it says I am. Okay. So Adrian, first off, thank you so much for bringing this in. As Adrian mentioned, I'm also tangentially involved in a few of the efforts that were discussed here, including the awkwardly named VC HTTP API, Alphabet Soup, but also the self-issued OpenID provider and a few other things. So to me, so first, Adrian, I want to say I really appreciate your perspective on asking this question about, is this security protocol the narrow waist? I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. But my personal perspective on this is that it is equally important to always ask the question where these things fit together. So on those layered diagrams, a lot of times the important questions in getting answered are, what do the interactions between those layers look like? That would, of course, it does, of course, have to be very, very clear when you're at the narrow waist, if you're at the narrow waist, because you've got the two most important boundaries sitting above and below you. but with a security layer protocol like Gnap, you've got to focus on, I believe you have to focus on the questions of where you're going to be connecting into the other things, right? So, for example, for the VC HTTP API, this is an API for getting cryptographic credentials moved around using web protocols, in short. There are a number of different ways that Gnap and the VC HTTP API could fit together, and they all have different bearings on where you view sort of the centrality of the protocol. For example, as an API, Gnap can be used to protect calls to it. Gnap could also be used to, in the process of gathering the credentials that would be used in the API. So, getting a user involved is something that Gnap and OAuth do. That's kind of the one of their main, selling points, if you will. And so, depending on which direction you're approaching the problem from, Gnap could look like a narrow waist, or it could look like just another function in sort of the overall structure. So I guess I guess my comment and question is, what dimension are you most interested in looking, and what is kind of like, what is it that you're looking, what kind of engagement are you looking for from the Gnap group?
Very brief answer, because I hope we have time for at least another perspective. Two components to your question. Number one, I'm primarily interested in delegation as a human right. We all understand why we get to choose our defense lawyer when facing the court or the state, why we get to choose our doctor when we face the hospital or the drug vendors. And so as we think about those different layers where Gnap might or might not, and you were very clear as to what you meant, is there really only one above and below, or is Gnap spread into the other layers of the hourglass? I think if at any layer we ignore delegation, we are introducing the potential for a human rights problem. And so that's the direct answer to your question. It's delegation all the way down, to use the turtles analogy. The second part of the thing is I am basically looking to potentially either take up within the Gnap group an appendix that discusses these 5 protocols, or whatever the right number is, that are being worked on, on top of DIDs and VCs, and either literally say about them what we said about OAuth, is here's what they don't do that needs to be done in Gnap, or help me start another work group. Hopefully many of us here will join this, and I'm new to IETF, so I don't know how to do that, so that we could take up this human rights issue in a place that is more friendly to human rights concerns than W3C. Thank you.
Thanks.
Chair, try to make the next question brief.
Oh, okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. So we'll go to Aaron now.
Yeah, hi. So I wanted to get your perspective on this point. I completely understand the thought behind the problems with the current deployments of the major OAuth providers being there's only a handful to choose from, and those are not things that you can really choose whether or not you get to have accounts there, and those accounts are of course owned by those major providers. And the vast majority of those major providers have require that consumers of the identities of those providers are registered entities themselves, which is, I think, what you're getting at with this point, the second point about the client credentials side of it, where you can't just go and make a login with Facebook button without having a relationship with Facebook as a developer. You have to go and sign up, establish yourself as someone who's going to be consuming those identities. My question is, so there is nothing in OAuth itself that actually requires that relationship. There's no requirement for client credentials at all. And there's dynamic client registration, which is in OAuth, which would allow someone to, without any prior relationship, show up and use a sign in with Facebook button or access data. So my question is, given that there is no actual requirement for that, yet this is the situation we find ourselves in, how do you expect to be able to prevent that situation from reoccurring in some other spec or other situation of this kind of environment?
A two-word answer with a slight expansion. Justin Richard. And the expansion is, and maybe Justin wants to actually pick up on this. We have worked on not just UMA 2.0, which is the wide world dynamic client registration thing, but also on the HEART work group, with which Justin and I, which is a profile of UMA and OAuth that Justin was an editor for, and I was a co-founder of 5 years ago. And you cannot get there from here. Now, if that's my opinion, as an advocate and not a geek, if Justin wants to pipe in for his opinion as to what failed about UMA 2 and the HEART work group as a profile of OAuth and UMA, we have time for him to do that, but he may just want to drop it and we'll take another question.
Cut the line here. We'll take the last two questions, but we just have 2 minutes left for this section, just to note that. So, Aaron, are you, okay, good. So Robin? Says go ahead, Justin. Oh, go ahead, Robin.
Okay, sorry. Thanks, Kathleen. Adrian, thank you again for bringing this. I guess my question is a very simple one. What is it in this model that would prevent a relying party from simply saying to the individual, here are all the pieces of data that I require about you, otherwise you can't access the service?
Again, it's the issue of delegation. As long as we are careful that it becomes obvious when the relying party is preventing you from choosing your defense lawyer or from choosing your doctor. I happen to be a physician, though I've never practiced medicine, and I only had a license for like 15 years and decided it wasn't worth the money every year. So I'm a geek. I'm an engineer by nature. But yes, that's basically what has to happen. Now, obviously, if the sovereigns, whether they're sovereign verifiers or sovereign issuers in the SSI sense, won't allow you to delegate to an intermediary of your choice, then yeah, you got to move. Thanks.
All right, Justin just dropped from the queue, so I think I will thank Adrian now, and we will move to the next session.
Thank you so much for giving me.
Sorry, I was just going to say, send any more questions and discussions to the list so that we can continue this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Justin Richer, joined also by Aaron Parecki and Fabienne Imbal. I will be doing the editor's presentation today. Aaron and Fabienne, please feel free to jump in at any point. Yeah, let's get started. So first off, we're going to talk about the changes in the drafts. We are now a 2-draft working group, which is 100% more than last we met. So we'll be talking about the changes in the core draft and also what's in the new draft and how we got there. We're going to be talking about an attack that was discovered and codified by some researchers, the mix-up attack. And also want to focus on some features that have been removed and changed significantly since the draft at the last meeting. And then we're going to end by talking about kind of our next set of big topics, kind of like where we're going next, and the status of implementations that we, the editors, knew about. And we'd like to really start calling preview there. We would like to start calling out more people who are implementing Gnap, implementing parts of Gnap, and that kind of thing. So you can go through the RFC diff if you want the detailed text changes for the core draft. The resource server draft is functionally brand new, except that a lot of that text actually came from the core draft to begin with. So a lot of the sections that you see deleted from the core draft version 4 have wound up in the resource servers draft and then been expanded on, but more on that in just a bit. Next slide, please. There's been a lot of work over the last few months. We have merged 36 pull requests against core, 10 against the resource servers draft, and you can use those URLs there to go look at GitHub and see the exact text changes for all of those. So just I'm going to now talk through the what the actual changes were. We're not going to go diving deep into every individual pull request. Especially because some of them undid the changes that earlier ones do, because this is an iterative process. But I do want to try to thoroughly cover the stuff that's changed since last time. So the discovery mechanism in the core draft, these are, by the way, these are all the PRs on the core draft. The resource server draft we'll discuss separately in just a little bit. And as I think the chairs are going to talk about later, that's figuring out how we're managing core versus the resource servers draft is something that is the topic of this working group now that we've got the 2 documents. Okay. So the first off, there were a bunch of small changes to the discovery mechanism inside of Gnap. So this is the stuff that allows a client instance to do a pre-flight call to the auth server and figure out different bits and parameters and things like that. As most in the group know, this type of discovery in Gnap is functionally optional because, as you know, the name suggests, the negotiation mode of the protocol or the negotiation nature of the protocol allows the different parties to be able to say, like, here's what I can do, here's what you can do, how can we, what is it that we overlap? It's meant to be, it's meant to be deployable in a way that you can actually talk to, an arbitrary installation and at least figure out what's going on. The discovery mechanisms, however, let you optimize that and let you sort of document, like, these are the pieces that I can do, and express that kind of thing ahead of time so that you don't have to, so that you can know ahead of time not to put in options in your requests or look for options in your responses that aren't going to be supported. And this is especially important if you're going to be doing multiple calls to something over time. Anyway, this discovery mechanism is fairly lightweight, and the changes here are relatively minimal, but they're reflecting other changes that we made down the line, including this next section about subject identifiers. I have to give huge credit to Fabian on this. He did a lot of great work with clarifying how subject identifiers work inside of Gnap. So this whole notion of being able to identify who the user is and potentially who the resource owner is, we've got some open issues for clarifying that language, but identifying the person that's there is really was an important driving use case for starting Gnap, because it allows Gnap to be able to say, without additional APIs, like just who's here right now. And we are aligning with the SEC event working group has a subject identifiers draft, which I believe is in last call or just out of last call, hopefully, Yaron, please. It's on its way. So we aligned with some of the latest changes from there that the editor had put in for supporting DIDs, for example, as a format. That's something that that, as Adrian mentioned, the DID community is pushing more stuff out there, and aligning with that ongoing format. One of the other important things about the subject identifier changes is that we've got a couple of features that Gnap had to invent things for, like we've got a user handle and a couple of other things that the editors are looking at now with these subject identifier changes in mind, and realizing that we might be able to actually simplify some of this stuff by reusing some of those same features. We haven't had the chance to go and make those specific changes yet, but this is important. A lot of changes on the cryptography and signing side. We changed how the Jose-based systems work, how access tokens get presented. We made some very specific changes to like how Depop gets used and normalization on claims, which is important at the cryptography and canonicalization layer of a protocol like this. Some of these ended up getting overcome by other changes, which we'll cover in just a moment, as the protocol itself, as the Gnap core protocol got kind of cleaned up. Regardless, there was a lot of stuff that got changed around how sort of the smaller details of how the cryptography stuff works. Next slide, please. We had some. I want to highlight here, this is a piece of, this is a non-editor PR, the cache control header. And somebody came along, Andre, I'm going to butcher their full name if I try to remember that. But they came along and were like, hey, you're not mentioning cache control here on any of these, you really should. And not only that, but here's where all of the places where it should be. Those types of things are, it's a small contribution in terms of like number of lines changed, but it is immensely valuable to the working group, and the editors absolutely love seeing this. So thank you so much for that. This is because this is an important detail for implementers that, you know, we either would have noticed eventually, or somebody would have tripped up and made a mistake, and then we would have noticed too late, basically. So thank you for that. A big change, which we're going to cover in its own discussion, is we extracted the portions of the core specification that talk about resource server communication out into its own separate spec. So I'll get those later. Another very big important change that actually ties a lot to what Adrian was discussing before, or parts of what Adrian was discussing before, was this notion of authorization and interaction and gathering consent. previously, we had inadvertently inherited a lot of language from the OAuth 2 world about, oh, the user interacts at the resource or at the authorization server, goes to a URL at the authorization server, and that type of thing. What was becoming clear in the discussions that we're having, especially with like the DID community and like the things like WebAuthn and newer technologies, is that this whole notion of having to send a user to the server, like sending them to a web page that was assumed by a lot of the language, really isn't necessarily core to the protocol. What's really happening here, and this change of language is meant to reflect this, is that the user is providing some amount of interaction with not just the authorization server, but potentially a bunch of other components that the authorization server has different kinds of relationships with. And the client can facilitate that connection. Like that was really at the core of what our interaction phase of Gnap really does. Is it makes that connection with the user. And so the thing about PR 242 is that it changed a lot of the language, but didn't actually make normative changes. It was a shift in how we're discussing different things, how we're approaching things like redirecting to a service or launching an application or stuff like this that people are already doing even in the OAuth world, but shifting that away from talking about it as going to something at the authorization server. Because what we realized is that there are a lot of use cases today in both OAuth and Gnap where people aren't going to the authorization server in the same way that we might think about that in our sort of simplified diagram. And this is where one of the things that that Adrian brought up, I think, starts to get really interesting. So that VC HTTP API that Adrian mentioned, this is something that the authorization server could either provide as a resource, or it could actually be a client itself of a VC HTTP API, meaning that the client instance, instead of saying, or in addition to saying, I could redirect you to a URL somewhere, it can say, hey, I've got claims about my user, verifiable credentials at this URL, at this API endpoint, and give the AS all of the information that it needs to be able to go interact with those and get signed VCs and proofs and be able to query things and all of this other stuff. Again, facilitated by the client and facilitated by this negotiation. You could technically already do that in Gnap, but it was less obvious because of the way that we had been discussing things. So hopefully that's something that we can actually see more of. I'm not saying that necessarily the VC HTTP API should be in Gnap core as an option, but that's the kind of thing that it's really important we allow for. We don't accidentally like box out of the realm of possibilities here. Because if we do box it out, then somebody's just gonna come up with a really weird way to patch it back in, which is exactly what's happening with OAuth and OpenID Connect and the VC HTTP API stuff right now. So we need to be aware of this. Okay, moving on. I know we spent a lot of time on that one. We added a privileges field to the access control array, whereas previously we had actions and identifier and location and data types. There was a long discussion about other things we might want to add to that, sort of for these core dimensions. This notion of privileges was brought up as something that really is orthogonal to these other things. Now, this is a description of the kind of thing that you're asking for in your access token. Not necessarily what goes into the token itself, because that is opaque to the client instance. And so this is part of the client's request saying, like, I know that to call this API, this is a privilege that I want to be able to have on this API. I also want to point out another important aspect here is that the what goes in that that access array, you have to keep in mind that that is completely controlled by the API that's being protected. Just like in OAuth 2, the definition of a scope is really only controlled by the API that's being protected, and therefore has to interpret that scope in the context of a given request. We have had some editorial changes, which we'll see in a moment, that try to clarify and expand that language. That's going to be an ongoing effort for this. And our sister group, OAuth, is working on the rich authorization request, which is a backport of this feature to OAuth 2. And that is nearing last call in that space as well. So, you know, we're trying to sync this language between the two so that the same concepts can be applied in both spaces. And the privileges field is a part of that. We added a new parameter for the mix-up attack. I'll talk about that attack in just a bit. And then the editors got bored and deleted a bunch of stuff. No, we had actual ongoing conversations about what people were using, why each thing in the protocol was in there. We're getting to the point of the protocol where it's starting to stabilize. The core is really stabilizing, so now's the time to really look at all of the stuff that's grown around it and be like, okay, why do we have this piece? Why are we doing this? Does it still make sense? Like I was saying before about the user handle, now that we've got this new opaque subject identifier, it probably doesn't make sense to have a separate field for that anymore. That's the kind of thing we're going to start really looking at. And I'll talk more about the specifics of the remove features towards the end of the presentation when we get there. Next slide, please. Whole bunch of editorial changes, and some of them small, some of them big. One of the biggest ones, though, was fixing up sort of the examples, especially the cryptographic examples. We now have a script that will generate properly formatted and signed examples for much of the spec. I'm not going to say everything that's in there, but the goal of the editors is to have those generated by real code. In the individual draft from over a year ago, the examples started as me copying and pasting from my personal implementation, and then a lot of things got edited by hand, and people noticed that the signatures weren't actually valid anymore, or that in at least one case that we didn't even have valid JSON in a spot. So anyway, a lot of that's being cleaned up. Obviously, there are probably still mistakes. We want to know where they are so that we can fix them, or you can fix them. There are also, there was a bunch of typos. Aaron actually did a bunch of work for updating and clarifying the diagrams that are throughout the document, including a new sort of foundational diagram that's right at the beginning of draft 6 that says, like, these are the major players and what they mean to each other. This notion of what the relationship is between the different parties, the different roles, how they, not just how they connect, but what they mean to each other. That's a really major topic that that the draft has, I'm proud to say, has made progress on, but we've still got a ways to go on that. We've also got some more text in there to sort of expands the rationale for not just why Gnap, but why Gnap is how it is. So, why are we doing particular things like representing clients by keys, for example, and why are bearer tokens now sort of a second class citizen, like little things like that, and helping somebody who's coming new into this space to be able to figure out what the difference is between this Gnap thing and something else that they may have seen in another space. And finally, back real quick, finally, we also updated a couple of flags, really small syntax type of stuff that we meant to do before, and we missed a couple of parts in the protocol structure. So those got in there, thankfully, and the reason I wanted to point this out is that we noticed there was a discrepancy because when we went to go implement the latest draft, we realized that we were sending strings in one place and booleans in another, and it didn't make sense for them to be different. So that's where that's coming from. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So the big document structure change, like I said, there's been a lot of changes since draft 4, but the biggest change you'll see is that there are now 2 documents. What we did was we took what was section 10 in the old document, or most of what was in section 10, and pulled it out into its own space. This is stuff that concerns interoperability for resource servers. Now, if you were here at the last IETF, we had a big discussion about kind of what this looked like and what the connections. And actually, if you could go to the next slide, there's one of the diagrams that we used. The idea with splitting this up was to have things that face a client instance in one document and things that face a resource server only in another document, because these legs of the triangle can vary independently of each other. Like that's fundamentally what it gets down to, is that I can do things to interact with users and get tokens and have different client deployments and do all of that in a completely different space from the decisions I need to make about what do I put in my access token? Am I using a structured format? Am I using references? Am I doing introspection? Am I doing, some shared memory bus thing? What does the token even represent? Like the client doesn't need to know about those decisions in order to do its functions. And the resource server doesn't need to know about what the client's doing in order to decide whether the access token it gets is good or not. So separating that decision space into these 2 documents was really key. So if you can actually go back a slide, there's a couple of bullet points. Thanks. What this functionally means is that we took resource stat registration and sort of resource server introduction, this dynamic introduction, into a different draft. Token introspection is in there because a client, this is something that is designed to face resource servers. There's open questions of whether clients should be allowed to do that and how that gets exposed. And also Yarn's got has already filed some important questions about how we handle discovery between these different sort of sides of the authorization server. Should they be the same? Should they be separated? What are the trade-offs there? We got to figure that out. And the important thing here, though, is that we now have 2 different places where we can focus the discussion so that we're not talking past each other. Because there were a lot of earlier discussions about like, oh, we need to decide what attributes go inside the access token, since that's opaque to the client software, to the client instance, that's not something that's really in for the core draft. So we now have a space to have that discussion about the kinds of things you could put in an access token. And it's separate from these other pieces. Fabian, I see you're in the chat. Do you want to hop on mic to talk about any of that?
Yes. Hello. So yes, we've had quite a few discussions on how to choose the token formats and how we are going to do that. And if you look at what's in the spec today, you'll see that there are many improvements on top of that. And so we speak about Biscuit and Zcap and a few other things. And I was hoping we could see with Sec Dispatch a way to formalize a bit more of these additional token formats, since we've got no standard for that. The only thing that's very well defined is JOT, of course. But here's, since exactly what Adrian was explaining before, we are trying to achieve also delegation and advanced types of scenarios, which basically require a bit more advanced cryptography type of requirements. And so that's, well, that's at least an open issue. And so far, what we've got in the document, from what Yaron explained as well in the issues, is we just have to have some links, but it's not official standards right now.
All right. Thanks. If you could actually go a couple of slides forward, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to talk about the mix-up attack. It was identified by a couple of researchers, and because I am a terrible person, I forgot to copy their names into the slides. I'm sorry. If somebody could actually add that to the notes, that would be appreciated. So sorry about that. But this is related to the OAuth 2 mix-up attack. If you're familiar with it, it basically works by getting a client that knows how to talk to multiple authorization servers to ask for a token at one AS, but get the user to interact at a different AS and have an attacker come away with an access token. Now, out of the box, Gnap is already in a better state than OAuth 2 because we don't have bare secrets as sort of a fundamental building block. So it is not possible, if, you know, assuming your keys are, the private keys themselves are not compromised, it's not possible for an attacker to be able to just easily impersonate a good authorization server and convince a client that they're talking to someone else. Also, the default in Gnap is for the access token to be bound to a key and not be a bearer token. You can ask for a bearer token, but if you're not asking for a bearer token, then the mix-up attack succeeds, but it succeeds in a detectable way because the client will not get back a usable access token. And so the client is going to notice that the access token doesn't work. In OAuth 2's mix-up attack, and if you're using bearer tokens in Gnap, the attacker gets the copy of the access token, and so does the client. So the client doesn't actually know this. You know, being able to detect these conditions is as important as being able to prevent these conditions in a lot of ways. So next slide, I'm going to talk through how this works. Now, I will say that there's a text write-up on the next slide as well. I'm going to talk through the diagram, but I encourage people to follow along with the text. So user starts off talking to their client instance, and this is a diagram from the researchers. So the user starts off by talking to the client instance, and the client instance, the players here are you know, the end user, the client instance. AAS is the attacker's authorization server, so this is the bad authorization server. And HAS is the legitimate authorization server. I don't know what the H stands for, but it's the good authorization server. It starts off by the user talking to the client and saying, oh, honest, thank you, Fabian. That's the honest authorization server. The user talks to the client and says, you know, go get an access token. and the client makes a legitimate request to the attacker's authorization server. So the client signs its request, it sends its interaction finish URI, it sends its own nonce, all of that stuff goes to the attacker server. Now the client software knows that it's talking to the attacker's authorization server. It knows the URL that it's talking to. So the client may misrepresent to the user in some human readable form, like, you know, which server you're going to or which service you're trying to access. But on the wire, the client knows that it's talking to AAS. AAS then turns around and makes its own request to the honest AS. So this means that AAS is acting as a proxy, so it is being a client instance to HAS. Now, if you require previously registered clients, that means that the attacker would have to have a registered client. Even if you don't, though, AAS cannot impersonate the legitimate client. All of this will be important in understanding how the attack works and how the mitigation happens. So AAS is acting as its own client, but it includes the nonce and the interaction finish URI from the legitimate client, but it signs it with its own key. Now, HAS says that's a fine request. Here's the server-side nonce. The interaction redirect URI that I'm going to send you to sends all of that back to the attacker's AS. The attacker's AS forwards that pretty much as is back to the client. Now the user redirects not to the attacker's server where the client was talking, but to the honest AS that the attacker is targeting. So they go there. As far as the user is concerned, they're approving access to client software. Now, once again, HAS knows that it's the attacker's software. They have that identifier, but in either a dynamic world or you just have a somebody sneaky using self-service registration, the attacker can disguise themselves enough to phish a user for this. So they interact, they approve it, and all of that comes back with the validation hash and the interaction reference back to the client. We're down in step 9 now. At this point, and here's where the attack hits. At this point, all of the information needed to make that validation hash was the client nonce, the server nonce, and the interaction reference. The honest authorization server has all of these. The attacker has the client nonce and the server nonce because it proxied those values back in steps 2 and 4 above. So what that means is that the validation hash in step 9 actually does validate. Even though the initial request going to one server is different from what would be expected by the honest authorization server. Now here's where the fallout of the attack starts to happen, is that the client forwards that interaction reference signed with the client's key to the attacker's server, and then the attacker sends that interaction reference on, it proxies that, again signed with the attacker's key, so it's not impersonating the client, to the honest authorization server and gets back an access token. Here, if it's a bound access token, the attack stops, the attacker gets a token, the user doesn't. Maybe they call and complain, maybe they don't notice. But at this point, the attack is over because the attacker has access approved by the client. So in summary, this is really substituting a client, getting a user to approve a client that they don't think that they're approving, and the access token being delivered somewhere else. 2 slides forward, please. The next slide is the description of that in text. There was also a thread on the list. Please go read through that for more details. The mitigation is based roughly on what the same mitigation is in OAuth 2, and that's to include something about the server that the user is interacting with. Now in OAuth 2, the accepted solution is to use this issuer parameter that goes back alongside the state and everything else. But what we realized in looking at this attack in Gnap is that this verification, this validation hash that we already had, we could actually mix in the grant request URL and have the same effect without having to add additional values on the wire, which an attacker could then possibly sit on that redirect and steal that. So what happens is you now mix together the client nonce, the server nonce, the interaction reference, and the URL and the grant endpoint URL, mix those together, which means that when that hash is initially generated, the honest authorization server is going to use its own grant URL. Like, it's not being told what that URL is on the way in by anybody. It's going to be using its own grant URL that the attacker called. The client, to do the validation, is going to use the attacker's URL. And so that hash won't match. Because this isn't an attack about the attacker like masquerading that request URL at all. That's a different kind of attack. But the client will be able to detect this if they validate that hash. Yes, this is still putting weight on the client to protect itself, which, as we know, client developers will do everything to avoid having to do more work. But this is a very simple addition to code that was already required by compliant client software to do here. So there's no additional parameters you have to check. There's nothing more you have to send, nothing more you have to protect. It's all information that you already have. And we validated this approach with the researchers who were looking at that. They confirmed that this does, in fact, cut off the attack. So this has been implemented in draft 6. And the PR that implements this was remarkably short, because it simply said, add this URL into this mix, and everything else should fall from that. Any questions on the mix-up attack before we move on? Because that was a fairly big piece. I guess I'll also pause to see if anybody had questions on the specific edits, although we're going to be talking about some more of the edits in just a sec.
No one's in the queue.
Okay, thanks. I did see Robin's question. Yes, the client is relying on the fact that the AAS and HAS URLs are going to be different. So it's a string that gets added in to the calculation. So yes, it is. And it's simply, what it boils down to is it's an identifier for the authorization server that cannot easily be co-opted by the attacker because it's the URL that the client is directly talking to. So thank you for that. All right, next slide, please. So, oh yeah, forgot about this. Wrap up. Basically, any redirect-based protocol is going to be inherently phishable. It's the nature of the space that we work in. And there are related phishing attacks if you're not using the finish feature as part of your interaction, because there's no interaction reference that you can protect in that. But this is kind of that's part of the trade-off of being able to do this with different kinds of clients. And while this is made easier by Dynamic World, it is still very possible, even with static clients, And we've seen this in the wild, in the OAuth world, with people using self-service client registration stuff to register things that to a human look a lot like Google Documents, but aren't. So next slide, please. So we removed a number of features in drafts 5 and 6. The first of which is the signature methods. The editors put out a call to the list a while back about this. We kept HTTP message signatures, which is still progressing in the HTTP working group. We kept MTLS based on the concepts from the OAuth MTLS work. We dropped the OAuth proof of possession, partially because that draft has long since expired, and it is probably going to be replaced by a new draft based on HTTP message signatures in the OAuth working group. That's in adoption call in OAuth right now. We also dropped OAuth Depop. Depop was never meant to be a signature method for like general HTTP signatures. What it covers is very limited, and it also has its own built-in key negotiation, which Gnap wasn't using. So it was an awkward fit from the beginning, and we've dropped both of those. The editors think that there's still discussion to be had for both of the Jose methods, both the attached and detached JWS. There wasn't a clear consensus whether we should keep them in the core, keep them as an extension, or drop them entirely. There were arguments for all of these and not really sort of a heavy leaning in any way. What the editors have done in the, for the moment is we've kept them in the core, but we have swapped out the examples to use HTTP message signatures throughout the document, except for obviously the specific examples of these signing methods, so that if we do pull them out, it will be cleaner surgery later. So a little bit of editorial reordering of sections and things like that, but overall, they're still in there. So we do think that we should have more discussion on this. Next slide, please.
If I may interject, out of this long list, I believe only one is must implement now. Is that correct?
So we don't actually have any listed as must implement yet. So mandatory to implement is going to be a different thing. We didn't add that language yet.
Okay.
There was some discussion about this, and the feeling so far, and I'm not going to go so far as to say that this is the consensus, but the feeling so far seems to be that HTTP message signatures will be the mandatory to implement for at least kind of a baseline, partially because MTLS is really deployment specific, where that makes the most sense for people, right? So HTTP message signatures at least gives you a baseline to be able to make a call and be told, no, go do something else instead. So that's what I saw in the discussion. I also land there personally as an individual. As an editor, I didn't see a call for that yet, but in the next revisions, we may honestly just put that stamp down and to get feedback in the group on that and see how we go forward. So, but the first step was at least culling the two, and we do think that the Jose methods are potentially fit for that as well. Particularly the attached JWS method, because it relies on replacing the HTTP entity body with a different entity body in order to use the method. And that's problematic for a lot of implementations, but this is something we got to figure out what we're going to do with these things. So thank you though. It's an important question. Capabilities was a sort of a pseudo discovery mechanism. I still like it as an individual. I think it's clever, but the thing is, we looked at it and nothing was using it. And it's really dangerous to have something in a security protocol that you think somebody will use for extending, but without actually exercising that. So we took it out for now. With the hopes that if we do come into a use case or an extension or something that explicitly needs this, we'll be able to pull back not only sort of the text that we had, but the discussion around that text, and start from a little bit better than scratch. So, like I said, I still think it's clever, but there just wasn't enough there. Next slide, please. Similarly, the existing grant, this was a way to ask for to make a new grant request based on a separate grant. So this isn't about updating a grant to get new rights, new access tokens. It's not about step up or step down. It's not about reading or managing an existing thing. It's about saying, give me something new in the context of something else. And it was one of those things that always kind of confused people, and people weren't quite sure what was going on. This was really coming from some advanced user-managed access to stuff, the ability to do this, and driven by a couple of sort of hypothetical use cases at the very beginning. But once again, we didn't really see a push that needed this right now. So the editors propose, what the editors have done is we've pulled it out from the core spec. But what we would like to see is that if people want this, that we actually attack this as a holistic feature, right? I think Adrian's trying to jump on the queue, if I'm watching the chat correctly here. You're very quiet, Adrian. I can't actually hear you.
Oh, sorry.
No, we still cannot hear you.
I think he's switching devices. No.
No.
No, sorry, no audio.
No, I think you need to unmute yourself in the application as well, Adrian.
Go. How about now?
That's better. Just speak up.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry. What I'm saying is, relative to the resource owner interacting with the resource server, I know of only two ways to do this. Either there's a pre-registration of an authorization server that the resource server has to agree to for the self-sovereign users, for self-sovereign delegates, authorization servers, or the resource owner has to get a capability.
Oh, I think he has a fire alarm. Okay, stay safe, Adrian. So the short answer, I don't know if you can still hear me, but the short answer is that that's not even what the capabilities field indicated. So what Adrian's talking about is that there's this security notion of a capability where it's a credential with its destination all sort of bound up into one thing. For a really sort of dumb version of it, think of it as a URL with an OAuth token on the end. You have everything you need to be able to just go to that magic URL and just use it. That's not what the capabilities negotiation array was about at all. And so that's another good reason to remove that. What Adrian's discussing, though, is exactly the kind of thing, this notion of like, how do we dynamically introduce resource owners into this process? That's exactly the kind of thing that the major editorial changes around the interaction and authorization gathering section was really about. And so so that was all very, very key to that part of the discussion. So yeah, hopefully that answered the question. Hopefully Adrian's safe, because that did sound like a fire alarm. So.
Thank you. That's all good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, so move on, please. Next slide. One last thing we pulled out. There were a couple of different ways to pass the client instance identifier. We narrowed that down to just one. It's basically what it boils down to. There was this at the very beginning. There was well, what if we needed this along with other information? And that what if has not yet materialized. And so again, what we've decided to do is we took out that kind of, underspecified what if feature, with the hope that if this really does need to be used, that we can bring it back in a way that's more robust and makes more sense in sort of a holistic approach, just like the existing grant thing. I think it was Yarn brought up the notion of like, what if we had a grant identifier to use there instead? Those are the kinds of questions that should be asked all together in the notion of what is this feature, why is it there, and what does it support, as opposed to the just bits and pieces that we're kind of dangling here. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? Our current discussion on the mailing list, one of our current discussions is, key rotation. Should we define a mechanism as part of Gnap, but also enable existing mechanisms? Some things that people do today are like host your keys at an external URL and have the other party fetch that, whatever keys at that URL. How do we want to manage this kind of stuff? Gnap has it uses keys as software identities all over the place, but it does not have baked in reliance on something like PKI. You can use PKI to solve all of these, but you can also use this without any PKI infrastructure. So the question is, how do we handle key management and specifically rotation in this kind of space? Or do we even handle it inside of Gnap itself? That is part of this question. And so far, the discussion seems to be saying we should handle it. And there have been a couple of good ideas about potentially how. So what the editors are going to try to do is put forward a concrete proposal of the couple of places that we think this function fits, that actually covers those use cases. One of the other things that we need more text and more discussion on is how these different components relate to each other. What are the assumptions that we're making about these different components? Like I mentioned previously, Aaron started that with that sort of introductory diagram and the text around that. Fabian's done a lot of really great work on sort of the entities and roles section. We need to keep expanding that. We need to keep expanding that so that it's more clear, like this entity trusts this other entity for this purpose in this context. And it's that type of transitive discussion that needs to be encoded in the draft. Right now, there are trust relationships, and they are mentioned in there, but they are not explicitly described as well as they could be. So we know that that's something that needs to happen. Another big thing is that, especially now that the editors believe that the sort of the core draft, the major churn is fairly stable, at least for now. So now is really our best time to look at what we've got and start really filling out security and privacy considerations. And the editors are already taking it as an action for the three of us to start building that text out along, and the trust relationships discussion is a part of that, because you're only secure if the thing that you're trusting to be secure is also secure. But we need to point that kind of stuff out. That all needs to be explicit, and all needs to be very specific. And then finally, we've got a lot. Our IANA section is complete hand waving. It says there will probably be registries. We need you to go make those registries. It's a lot of mechanical stuff there, but we think that we've got a decent feel on the fields that are clear candidates for extensibility through registry versus those that really should be locked down more specifically. And there are related issues about guidance to extensions, like what does it make sense for an extension to be able to say here? How does it fit in with the other functions? So that's part of all of that. Next slide, please. Actually, you can keep going because I already talked about queue rotation. Implementations. So without actual running code, this is all just an idea. We don't believe in that here at the IETF. So I've updated the Java implementation that I personally work on, which is XYZ because I'm terrible at naming things. That's been updated to the latest draft of Gnap, including all of the flag changes and all of the syntax changes that we mentioned before. Although, come to think of it, I'm not sure I don't think I actually fixed the discovery document. I'll have to go do that right after the call. But there are implementations that I know about, or that the editors know about in Python, PHP, and Rust in the works. Some of them from us, some of them not from us. There are also more implementations on on sort of our core dependencies, specifically HTTP message signatures and security event identifiers. So there are libraries that are coming up to that are getting worked on, libraries and implementations that support these that'll help people that are developing Gnap. Once again, I want to state that the editors really do honestly believe that sort of the major core churn that you see in early days of a protocol definition is largely settled. This isn't final. There's still a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of text to be added. And there's still going to be a dozen things that need to get bike shedded. We know this. But we do think that it is a very, very good time to start implementing this, to start trying it out, to start actually fitting it into different spaces. And I've reached out to a couple of the groups that had worked on early implementations of the XYZ proposal from before the Gnap working group about updating to Gnap for their systems and following the draft. And so we'll see where we go from there. Oh, Robin, bike shedding. Very shortly, bike shedding is arguing about what to name things. It comes from the adage of arguing over what color to paint the door of the bike shed instead of building the damn bike shed. All right. And that, I believe, is, yes, that's it. So I'm going to hand it back to the chairs now. Take any final cue questions before we move on. I know we're right about at time.
So maybe one word before we move on. Could you mute yourself? I think go echoing.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So just one word before we go into questions and discussions. The editor seems to be very optimistic about the completeness of the protocol right now. Please give it a read, not as detailed as you would for working group last call, but let's catch them in what are missing features, and also we used to have too many ways of doing signatures. We still have a few too many. Are there other things that are duplicates, that are redundant, that can be removed and maybe come back as extensions, or maybe not? So a quick read by everybody here would be highly appreciated. And now, if you have any questions, comments regarding any of the two, or well, mainly the core protocol, please get on the queue.
All right, Dennis.
Dennis, I believe you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So an issue has been reopened 6 days ago. It's the issue 295, and the title is "In Practice, Only Rights Are Supported, but Attribute Should Be Supported as Well." So it's currently an open issue, and I believe this issue will need to be addressed. Basically, today, an access token can contain either a set of rights or attributes. And when we define a privilege, it's a right or attributes associated with the subject. So currently, Gnaps only support rights, but not yet attributes. And if you support attributes, you can support attribute-based access control and role-based access control. And I believe the core document should define two fields so you can know immediately from a RS point of view whether the token contains rights and or attributes. So I have a proposal to explain how this should be done. Now, I would also like to address another message, which is one finding about the current document, which I believe is important. And in section 7 today, it is stated in Gnap, the client instance secures its request to the AS by presenting an access token. Well, I believe that it's possible to simplify many things because clients' instance keys are if we make clients' instance keys no more necessary, and it could be very easy. Today, the security consideration section states all requests have to be over TLS or equivalent. Now, if we mandate the authentication exchange between the user and the AS to be also protected using TLS, then you don't need client instance key anymore. And that it would allow many simplification because all the communication going through the channel are protected by the channel. That's it.
Thank you, Denny.
Jamie?
Yes, I'm finished.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I just discovered this working group this morning while I was trying to figure out what to do with my first IETF meeting, so hope this is a reasonable question.
Welcome.
Thanks. After reading the core protocol current draft, the resource access rights, I note that the types are left completely unspecified here because it's assumed that the client knows what kinds of resources it's asking about. I was wondering if it would make sense either to define a sort of a generic HTTP resource type where your actions are just HTTP methods and the locations are just URLs, or to have maybe a IANA registry for resource types so that you can have some common ones. I'm particularly thinking of, I was really happy to see that the RS First AS discovery is in there, because I've wanted for a long time for OAuth to be able to be used in place of like HTTP basic or digest auth. And this looks like it's almost there. So that, I guess that's my my wondering is if there's a way to use Gnap as a better form of HTTP basic or digest auth for generic HTTP resources.
Looks like Justin's in the queue. Likely to answer that?
Yeah, this is to answer Jamie. That's a really interesting idea. The resource access rights and OAuth 2's rich authorizations requests have discussed this notion, or the notion of registering the types somewhere. And the consensus has been that we don't want to require registration of types, but having a catalog would be an interesting one. Now, that's not usually what an IANA registry is used for, so there might be a better form or venue for something like that. I think that would be a really interesting thing to see. I don't know what that resource would look like. As far as the generic HTTP, that is a fascinating idea. I would love to see that written up more if you could bring that to the list. And that may even be something that perhaps we use that in one of the examples. That's a really neat idea. So thank you for both of those. Hope to see you participate more. These are great questions, and there's a lot of discussion that fits in well with.
Aaron?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to some of what Dennis said. In particular, the point about TLS. This has been an ongoing conversation that we've been having on a GitHub issue, in case anybody is curious in looking at some of the previous parts of that discussion. But the idea of dropping client instance keys, I have not yet seen a proposal for how to effectively get the same level of security as the client instance keys provides, using just dropping the keys as described currently. So there would have to be something else added back to that, which I have not seen Dennis propose yet. The main security property that we gain by client instance keys is being able to bind access tokens to individual instances of clients, as in it is a particular install on a particular mobile phone that has its own keys that are different from the sort of quote unquote same app installed on another phone, such that you can't pick up an access token and use it in another app because the underlying keys would be different. You don't get that property using just HTTPS, so you need to do something else on top of that, and I haven't seen that be proposed yet.
All right, it looks like the queue is empty, and it's just about time to move to the next and last section of our meeting. And I will be asking Kathleen to describe to go through the first slide, please.
Sure. So after some consideration and discussion with Euron this morning, and we wanted to propose out to the working group a workshop to invite people in to analyze and do security protocol proofing in case there's any gaps in the protocol now or considerations that need to be raised, just like TLS did before TLS 1.3 was published. It would be much better to fix it in advance. And so this is just a proposal, which is why there's a question mark. Would a 2-day workshop, 4 hours per day work, assuming that it would be remote? Because thinking, the next year it would be really hard to get people to travel consistently from around the world with, various statuses and capabilities of traveling. So we'd like to get a little bit of feedback on interest in this, and also willingness to reach out to researchers to invite them to analyze the protocol or different aspects where they have expertise, be that cryptography, or they've been involved with OAuth, for instance, or other authorization protocols, and would like to spend some time trying to find some holes. Any thoughts? Justin.
Thanks, Kathleen. So the OAuth Security Workshop, OSW, has really started to take its own, this is an annual security-focused workshop for the OAuth protocol and sort of family of protocols, but it's really started to take on a life and identity of its own, to the extent that the founders of the workshop have started to reach out. They reached out to the editors, to the Gnap editors, asking us if we would even be interested in being, coming in and talking about Gnap, or having Gnap be a focus of part of that workshop. So I think that this aligns very, very well with that. And personally, I 100% agree. Get this in front of a bunch of smart people and let them throw hatchets at it. That's the only way we make it better.
Justin, is the date for OSW?
I was explicitly told not to mention anything about dates. There are some provisional ones, and I am not allowed to share them yet. So keep an eye out from folks like Daniel Fett, who are organizing that, in terms of like what kind of conference it is, when and where it's going to be, and stuff like that. But traditionally, it's been an annual conference sometime around the spring IETF, give or take. And so I cannot say when it will be.
Thank you, Robin.
Hi, is the mic on?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think that sounds like a really good idea. I think the security protocol proofing it obviously is functionally necessary. It might not attract a huge audience. I think if it can be accommodated in the scope of the workshop, some discussion of the trust relationships that Justin mentioned in the draft roadmap would also be extremely useful and might have slightly broader appeal.
Okay, great. So discussion and suggestions such as that would be great to see on the list so that we can make sure we track everything. And of course, that'll be in the minutes as well. So thank you. If there's more feedback, I think we'd all like to hear it. So please put that on the list.
Thank you, Kathleen. And more generally, so, like we said, the editors feel that the core document is stabilizing. So I'd like to propose basically a framework of progress for the core draft. So to start with, in my opinion, we should separate progress on the core draft versus progress on the resource server draft, I think trying to progress both in parallel would be very difficult. And so let's focus on one, even if the other one is being amended in parallel. Let's not force a dependency. And so obviously the missing big pieces right now are the security and privacy sections, as well as IANA registries. Justin already mentioned these. We have a list of use cases that we collected a while ago, and I'd like to ask the editors to go back to this list of use cases, find out if we're really covering them, find out if we're not, and come back to the list with what's being covered and what we consciously decided we don't want to cover, or we don't know how to cover, or whatever. We have a bunch of open issues right now. As of yesterday, I believe it was a bit over 100 just for the core document, and then a few dozen more for the RS draft. So obviously we cannot say the document is stable when we have over 100 open issues, and I would suggest just completely arbitrarily to bring the number down to about 10. And then, in my opinion, that would be a reasonable gate for working group last call. Obviously, working group last call, everybody reads the document. There's a bunch of comments, maybe reasonably large changes. Hopefully, no major features or no major changes, but we might need to iterate a little bit after working group last call, because if we are to have a security review, and especially if people are using formal tools, we will need to have sort of a feature freeze. And this is what we had for TLS 1.3 when it went through a lengthy security review by the academic community. And I would like very much to have this level of review from the community. Then after security review, maybe they don't find anything, maybe they do. We need to complete the document based on that feedback and any other feedback that's come since, and possibly have a second working group last call. That happens. That's not a tragedy. And then we are ready to publish the document as an RFC. So it's a long process. I'm avoiding dates here. Kathleen's proposal for a workshop was for 6 months from today. I think that kind of lines up with these steps. I'd like to hear from you people what you're thinking about this plan. Yes, no, too slow, too quick. Or AD, please. Roman.
Wondering, in addition to everything we just described, which is fabulous, whether we could also talk about getting interop results. I heard Justin showing a list of implementations. I don't know whether we have an interop matrix that we could populate as well.
Justin?
Yeah, just we don't yet. There are a couple that I have plugged together at various stages of implementation. We don't have enough implementations of draft 6 to have a meaningful matrix yet. Because like I said, there was a bunch of stuff in the security layer, the signing layer that changed that broke everything, right? Not yet. I would also love to see that. I would also like to encourage this group to consider something like what OpenID Foundation has for the OpenID Connect core protocol and its profiles, in that there is an automated test suite that you can go and basically point your client at or your server at, and it acts like the other parties in the ecosystem and gives you results of like, what did you do based on all of these other things. Now, that's a lot of work and a lot of tooling to get there, but you know, the OIDF's suite is, at the very least, it is open source. So if you know, that could be the basis of an effort like that. I would love to see that also, and I would also love to see a matrix. Getting the time and engineers on that is, of course, always the problem.
Yeah. Well, there's a common pitfall. Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. Please go.
There's a common pitfall where the implementation or the open source becomes the spec. I don't want us to head there. Our main deliverable is the paper, the document. And so if the editors or the community at large wants to create tooling, that's all great. But the focus should be on having the best document possible. All right. And now a few questions. Some were already raised, and some are lurking out there. So my personal belief is we can progress the drafts one by one. There's enough separation between them. People might disagree, and perhaps after you read both drafts more deeply, you will disagree. So please discuss it on the list. I've already asked everybody to read the two documents to make sure we don't have any remaining big holes that the editors may have missed. And then there's the bigger question of how does this relate to the bigger OAuth community, to the evolution of the OAuth protocol itself, and the ecosystem, OpenID, and so forth. So we need a lot more review from the community, and we need active engagement with the community, both outside the IETF, OpenID Forum, as well as our sister working group, the OAuth working group. We have some people who are on both working groups. I believe we don't have enough. And if we are to have a very open discussion, OAuth 2.0, OAuth 2.1, and then what? I think we need a lot more engagement on both sides, a lot more coming together of the two working groups to have a meaningful discussion. So, any more ideas or opinions about these issues? Or any proposals on how to engage? Fabien.
Yes. Well, what we did recently with the annex, the appendix B on the OAuth protocol was published actually as a paper, and it was discussed during conferences as well. And so we had also discussions with guys like Daniel Fett as a consequence of things like that. So that's also something we could do, is have broader communication to the wider community as well. Not stay within the IETF in some cases and get the work presented elsewhere as well, I think.
All right. Any other comments to these questions or anything else we discussed today? All right. If there's nothing else, I'd like to thank Kathleen and Leif and all of you people, and have a great IETF week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Yaron, and everyone.
Thank you.